Welcome to High Performance Hockey Podcast. Before we introduce today's guest, today's question comes from Robert. As a reminder, please DM us questions on our Twitter handle at the HPH_podcast. We'll do our best to answer those in a timely fashion. Today's question comes from Robert. What advanced training methods do you use for your athletes with large training ages? And that's a great question. Let me rewind and say that my strong suggestion for young athletes is just simplicity, linear periodization, progressive overload. I also think simple programs can work for advanced athletes, but for other reasons. Once we tax out the ability to load the athlete in terms of intensity and volume, right, that it essentially stalls the higher and higher training ages we get. We try to strive for adaptation through variation. And I stole this idea from Dr. Matt Jordan, and he had referred to it as a force output umbrella and the variety in that umbrella that we use with our advanced athletes with higher training ages. And I break it down into, concentric, isometric, amortization, and eccentric. So, concentric methods that we may use, nothing crazy. Starting strength, speed, strength. So we'll hook up the linear position transducers. Wouldn't do that for a beginning athlete. Isometric, we may do yielding, overcoming isometrics, post-fatigue, pre-fatigue. Amortization, we may do oscillatory training. And eccentric, we may do different forms and variations of fast eccentrics, drop catch, or reflexive eccentrics. I think the most important thing, though, Robert, is where you place those within the course of the microcycle. So I hope that helps. Without further ado, today's guest is President of Strength Tech Fitness and Wellness, Lorne Goldenberg. Lorne brings extensive experience in high-performance sports training with professional and elite amateur athletes. He's worked with thousands of individual pro hockey stars over the past 40 years. He's one of the first few strength and conditioning coaches in the National Hockey League in the late 1980s and has worked with 7 NHL teams. From 2018 through 2022, he worked exclusively with Ben Roethlisberger as a quarterback for the Pittsburgh Steelers as his sports performance director. Lorne has also worked in the CFL, OHL, QMJHL, Olympic athletes, and many years with Gary Roberts High Performance Training. Lorne graduated from the University of Ottawa with an honors degree in physical education, is certified by the National Strength and Conditioning Association as a certified strength and conditioning specialist. He's also a certified exercise physiologist through the Canadian Society of Exercise Physiology. Lorne is also the president of Ottawa, Ontario-based Strength Tech Fitness and Wellness Consultants, which provides workplace health and wellness programs in Ontario and Alberta. Lorne currently resides in Pittsburgh, PA. Fantastic conversation. Lorne has done this for 40 plus years. Fantastic wealth of information. We talk about his early days in the National Hockey League. We talk about his idea on aerobic training, and we talk about pendulum swings, whether it be technology and advice to young coaches. It's a fantastic hour of learning and great dialogue. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Goldie. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, really happy to be here, Anthony. I've been following your podcast for a couple of years now, and congrats on how great you've made this thing grow and be.
I appreciate it. I'm speaking now to one of the OGs in strength and conditioning in terms and measures of hockey. I look back at your career, and we're going to talk about it piece by piece, but literally, you were in the National Hockey League when I was in diapers. I was born in 78. I say diapers, late 80s, strength and conditioning started appearing in the National Hockey League. So let's start with this, Goldie. Walk us back to those days. Head strength and conditioning coach, St. Louis Blues, 86, 87. I would imagine the landscape is a lot different at that time than it is now. Obviously, I know it is. But what was it like back in those times?
Well, it was different for sure. I think I was like the third or fourth guy in the league. There were some other guys who were consultants and stuff, but I want to say we were the very first team to ever hold like a development camp. Wow. And we brought in like 30 guys into St. Louis, like junior and a couple of good American leaguers.
Yep.
And we went through like a 3.5 day mini camp where, these guys got up, They had breakfast, probably not like the breakfast players get today, but they provided a breakfast. Then it was over to the rink for a meeting and some video with the coaches. Then it was on with me for we did a warm up. We might have done some testing. We might have done a lift. Then they would break off for lunch. They'd come back, another video meeting, another off ice workout, dinner. Like they were full days. And these kids had never experienced that. And I mean, it was hard on me. I had never like coached that long throughout a whole day because I was involved in all these meetings and what have you. But I think it's really evolved since, obviously. But we had a dungeon of a workout in the bowels of the old St. Louis arena. It was full of equipment that probably came out of a commercial gym that went bankrupt. I remember there was an old bicep curl machine. I think we had a leg extension machine. There was a squat rack. We had 2 bars. They were rusty. The metal plates were rusty. We had a set of dumbbells and a couple dumbbell benches. And I ran an NHL training camp through all of that. It was a challenge. It was a challenge because, I was 26 or 27 at the time. I thought, man, I got my NHL job. And like the gym in my house was nicer than this NHL weight room.
Wow.
So it was a build up.
Yep.
And then it was a letdown, I never regretted doing it. And I was happy to be involved with a number of teams where we were able to build out rooms, but it was a real eye opener. It was a challenge. The tools were limited for sure.
The opportunity that presented itself, Goldie, I know, your passion, you always have loved football, but how did that opportunity come about? How did you get contacted? What were the events that led up to your opportunity in St. Louis?
Well, I think one, it was actually Don Shula, the former head football coach of Miami Dolphins, was the guy who said, "Hey, kid, like I applied for jobs with every NFL football team. I have a file somewhere with like letters from guys who have died back in the."
I did not know that, Goldie. I had no clue.
Yeah. And so I was down in Miami. And this is back in the days when security wasn't as big as it was now. After practice, I just walked on the field. I walked right up to Coach Shula, introduced myself, said, what does a guy like me have to do? Like I was already working for the Ottawa Rough Riders at the time, and told him about my passion for football. I really wanted to get down to the States. What do I need to do? And he said, "Hey, Lorne, I appreciate you coming out, but," he says, "there's thousands of schools down here that have strength and conditioning staffs, and they're looking for jobs. I hate to say it, but why don't you focus on hockey? Because hockey is such a Canadian sport." And at the time, I was working out of a Nautilus Fitness Center. It was the first Nautilus Center ever brought into Canada. We had a lot of football kids there. We started to have a little dribble of hockey kids, but it was mostly football because Nautilus equipment was so prevalent in the National Football League and in articles and media, like in the time, right? So we finally started. I went and aggressively offered services out to the Ottawa 67. So that was my intro into hockey. And we had guys back then like, Gary Roberts was a junior back then. We had guys like Gray Nomstead and Dave Roboth, and who really stick out in my mind, who were kids that they didn't make it pro, but they had really good CIS careers. They had really good OHL careers, and they made something of themselves and implemented health and fitness for the rest of their lives. So those were wins. But I started to get a little bit of a reputation, like working with guys. And so after 2 years with the 67s, I just started sending out mailed letters and resumes to every coach and GM in the league. And back then you had to go through the old printed media guides to get their addresses. And I hit the jackpot when it got into Jacques Martin's hand, because ironically, I want to say about 5 months before Jacques Martin got hired, I had sent that package to Ron Caron, who used to be known as the Professor. He was a general manager of the St. Louis Blues. And he sent me back a letter saying, "Hey, really appreciate it. We're all staffed up. No need in this area." And then Jacques Martin got hired, who had a phys ed degree from St. Lawrence University. He won a Memorial Cup in Guelph, really emphasizing fitness. So my resume landed in his lap just at the right time. And him kind of being from Ottawa, me being from Ottawa, we knew some people, and it just worked out. Yeah.
So such an amazing lesson too. I just had 3 conversations with great coaches: Kevin Neal, Brajesh Patel, Kurt Truey, all talking about the importance of literally putting your name out there, going, visiting places, writing your resumes, sending them out, doing the hard work. The expectation is not overnight success. The path, you have to cross first, second, and third base before you hit home plate. I think there's a lot of messages in that. I didn't know that story, so fantastic, Goldie. I'm going to talk about mentors. Chicago, Quebec, Ottawa, Florida, Montreal. I mean, you've had a storied career in the National League. Who are your mentors? And I maybe break it down to one or two. I know you probably have plenty of them. And then what qualities did you admire in those people, specifically in the game of hockey? I know you've dealt with football as well, but let's talk hockey.
Yeah, well, Jacques Martin, obviously, because he was instrumental in me, one, getting into the league and then introducing me to some of the other coaches like Mike Keenan and Mark Crawford over the years. But Jacques was a guy who was really, I mean, an amazing hockey coach, obviously, but he was so into structure and organization. Like, my first year in St. Louis, before workouts, like him and I would have a meeting. He'd want to see what I was doing. How was I going to run it? What was the focus? And he would never criticize me. He'd want to know, and he'd want to know that I had some logic to what I was doing. That's all he wanted to know. He wasn't going to say, hey, why don't you do a split squat instead of a back squat or what have you. He was such an organized, structured guy. Like he does that again, like today, he's a consultant with the Ottawa Senators, and that's what kind of stuff he does with the Senators, making sure that they're on par with all of that. And then Mike Keenan was an interesting guy. Like, I want to say we had a love-hate relationship. He hired me. I had a lot of respect for him. He had a lot of respect for me. Yep. As a matter of fact, I didn't work in Chicago full time. He wanted me to. He wanted me to. And he had to justify my existence there. He's like, you're going to pick up the visiting team's bags at the airport. And I was like, whatever I was, 28 at the time. I said, I'm in. And he looked back and he said, just went dead silence for a second. He's like, Goldie, you can't do that. Players are going to lose respect for you if you're doing that. He goes, you didn't go to school to do that. He says, I'll figure out a way of getting you here. And so I spent 3 years with Mike, and he was really all about, commitment and attention to detail. Like he was an over the top guy, an amazing guy to have a beer with, but he taught me, I want to say grinding.
Yep.
Grinding.
Yep.
And how to work a full day and, push on the players, like push them. Because back then they wouldn't push themselves as much as they would push now off ice.
Yep.
Right. They would go on ice. Like Mike Keenan, had some amazing, he had 45-minute practices, all up tempo, very little talking. It was like, go, 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 go. So they were getting a lot of conditioning there also. And one guy I do want to mention also is just E.J. McGuire, who used to be, I worked with him in Chicago. He had a PhD in psychology and a phys ed degree from, I think, Kansas College in Buffalo. And amazing guy to work with. He really taught me really about the commitment and attention to detail and understanding players. And he became the director of scouting for the National Hockey League. He was very supportive of the strength and conditioning coaches at the time. Guys like Scotty Livingston will tell you, we worked on committees with him to help try and build out the testing and drive a better testing platform. So those guys really helped me understand the game, a little bit of life, a little bit of work and grinding, and really grateful for my experience with those guys.
Outstanding, Goldie. Physical quality standpoint. Now, you got to walk us back. I know we're talking late 80s, early 90s. What were your big rocks at the time? What did you value as a young coach? And then in retrospect, maybe this is a difficult question to answer. Now looking back in hindsight, did you overvalue certain qualities at the expense of others?
Well, you might be surprised with what I think is my big rock.
Okay.
And for me, it was buy-in.
Buy-in?
Buy-in. That was my biggest rock, because I wanted to go into that room. I wanted to gain respect. I wanted them to know that what I had to offer to them were going to make them better hockey players, more efficient hockey players, fitter hockey players, help them to be able to do the job that they need to do, which means possibly winning, staying maybe injury-free, winning championships, what have you. And it was at the beginning, it wasn't easy, but it got easy really quick because I was really lucky being in it so early, you know, training guys like Gary Roberts, Joe Newendike, Joe Sakic, Daniel Alfredson, Danny Briere, like I had the stars of the stars in their heyday, let's say. So when I walked into a room and we had a development camp, I could talk stories about these guys and experiences that they've had and paths that they had to travel on. And I think that really helped me from a buy-in perspective. I never really had too much trouble with it as I probably got into my third or fourth year working with pro players. But the big rock for me from a physical standpoint was strength, because there's only one place you can develop strength, and that's in the weight room. Because that requires overload and tension, right? Speed, endurance, footwork, even power. You can work on that in practice. You work on that in the game because you're working maximally for every single one of those shifts, right? But strength is the big component that can't get worked other than the weight room. And so, and you had to handle it sometimes with kid gloves because, like in my very first training camp, I remember Bernie Federko comes up to me and I'm like, I'm going, right? We got this workout going. People are hopping and moving. And he comes up to me. He says, "Hey, Goldie," he goes, "I've been in this league 17 years. Just like I'll follow what you're saying, but just dial it back a little bit, you know?" And what am I going to say to Bernie Federko?
Right? Not much.
No, not much. And anyhow, but over time, I got guys to buy into the concept of lifting weights,
Yep.
right? Like Joe Sakic was actually the first guy I ever got to do morning lifts on game day.
Yep.
On game day.
Yep.
Well, Joe was doing it. Yep. All of a sudden, like after a couple of games, there's like 5 more guys doing it because they felt unbelievable doing like 2 sets of lightweight and, being forceful with it and creating power and velocity and they felt good. And hey, guess what? They're not fatigued at night, right? So that kind of helped me get that buy-in. So I always say it's strength, because strength is one of those components that I feel if you're not taking care of it at least once a week at a higher intensity, right, then you're losing.
And I think too, we can pick the pepper that a fly should all we want, but especially with an 82 game schedule, you have to find those times to do it, because if you take too long in between, you get sore, right? Yeah. And you take too long in between, you can lose what you've built in the off season. The whole goal there is to try to bridge that gap, create an environment where the players are fresh for games, but also simultaneously finding spots within the season, within the week, to hit those little windows, call it micro dosing, whatever the hell you want to call it, lift something heavy with intent, right?
Yeah, and just so you know, I was microdosing back in the late 80s.
Hey, listen. What do they say, Goldie? Tell me what it was 30 years ago, or under a different name. That's what we did. I think we have all these fancy terms now. Microdosing being one of them.
Yeah, if only I would have came up with the online microdosing course.
All right, slight pivot. I know you've talked about this at length before. I want to revisit a SCAF article. This was an article, and this is titled "My Thoughts on Aerobic Training in Hockey After 30 Years." Considerations for preparation. Can you give us kind of an overarching, why up to the article and talk about the importance of it? And then I can kind of pick some questions as we go.
Yeah, I don't want to go into all the steps of the Krebs cycle, but big rocks to understand why, because I think, and it has a little bit to do with social media, I think, and young coaches taking the concept of sports specificity to the nth degree. And I think it's hurting player development in some aspects for some kids and players. But I mean, fundamentally, there's 3 energy systems: ATP, PC, lactic, and aerobic system, right? And they all build off each other. You don't really work on them in silos. They all work together. Your body doesn't turn one off and use it. Like everything's always working. And I think coaches look at the physiology of the game, that being 30 to 60-second shifts. They're 5 to 10 second bursts within that 30 to 60 seconds. Well, hey, let's just create a program made of, short bursts. Let's do 10 seconds on and 50 seconds off. Well, that's pretty well ATP PC, right? Or we can do 10 seconds on and 10 seconds off. We'll do that 20 times. Well, that's aerobic. But the problem is the effort for those two intervals, they're all maximal. Like they're working maximally. And that really, I find, is more of a focus. Well, the literature supports it, more of developing your peripheral system. And it's great to do that, but we're also doing strength training. We're doing plyometrics. We're doing movement skills. Like, they're probably on the ice. So they're getting all of that. But the heart and lungs is the driver of everything, your oxygen, your blood supply. And if that's not developed specifically, then I think you're compromising that system, all for the sake of saying, well, that's really not the energy system specific for hockey. And I quote in that article a guy named Andrew Flatt. I think he's University of Georgia.
HRV guy, right, Goldie? He's the
HRV guy.
Yeah.
HRV guy. And this guy's, well, first of all, he's from Kitchener-Waterloo, played football at University of Waterloo, so got to give him props for that. But he in this podcast that he did it was a rugby podcast, and he just said, the guys who are more aerobically fit using aerobic methods are going to have a better HRV scores. They deal with stress better. They deal with tension better. They recover from games and workouts more effectively. So why would you want to limit that? Because when you go back and you look at the hockey season, the hockey season could be like 10 months for some teams, depending how deep they go in the playoffs. And so that's 10 months of anaerobic work. And then you want to go into the offseason and do more anaerobic work right away. Like it just doesn't work for me. But and you may have listened because I was on Mike Boyle's podcast 2 years ago, and we had a heavy discussion about that. And Mike and I will continue to agree to disagree.
Of course,
but at the same time, as he mentioned, there's two guys who've been in the league a long time and have had a lot of success with it. So as Mike said, if some guy came to me and said, Lorne said to do 30 minutes of zone 2 work twice a week, I'm like, whatever, go ahead. But I don't know if I'm actually going to do it. So,
yeah. Well, it's interesting, right? 5 plus 5 is 10, and so is 8 plus 2. They can get different spots. Having said that, though, I'm with you. I'm on. I don't think it should be either or. I look at it as at an interesting talk with one of the co-founders of Moxie Monitor, which looks at oxygen saturation. He just simplified it for me. It made me understand a little bit more. The delivery, the central portion, heart and lungs, and the utilization, which is the muscle, right? And there's very different adaptations. Now, with that technology, they can look at the deficiencies in either. But let me read this verbatim. Central adaptations, eccentric cardiac hypertrophy, fill the left chamber with more blood. That's great. Increased stroke volume, more blood pumped each heartbeat, decreased resting heart rate, better HRV scores, increased heart rate recovery. Those are all central adaptations. Peripheral, increased oxygen enzyme kinetics, increase in myoglobin affinity, increase in mitochondria, increase in capillary density. So I think, to me, it's not one or the other. I think it's filling buckets that aren't filled at certain portions and being smart enough as a coach to know when to do it and how to do it.
Exactly. I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah.
And I just think people get, carried away. They get carried away with it and just don't understand those simple facts that you just outlined between central and peripheral. And the other key point of it too, and I reference it in that article, is that these guys are getting coached by the hockey coaches and strength coaches like 12 months of the year. Like, is it a big deal to have them go out twice a week, go out for a 30, 40-minute bike ride? They're outside. They got their heart rate monitor. Nobody yelling in the air, hey, pull your toe up when you're coming up on the cycle, or, let them get away from the oversight and let them enjoy the outdoors, because they're inside all the time. When they're strength training at your facility, they're inside. When they're on a hockey practice, they're inside. Like, let them get out and get a breath of fresh air and get their head mentally cleared also. And I think people don't take that into account when they make their decisions on their energy system programming.
Having said that, last question on this. What are the methods that you prefer to work the aerobic system? You just mentioned bike rides. You just mentioned outdoors. One thing that we really like to do, and I'll tell you the reason why. It's again the Charlie Francis high-low. We really love tempo runs. The reason I like it is it works the aerobic system, but we do so at a higher pace or a higher velocity than we would in a 2 or 3 mile run, right? We walk the end zone. We still got that aerobic where we're running below whatever our fictitious subjective 70%. Guys are outside. So we like that. I also like aerobic intervals or aerobic circuits, right? We keep our heart rate around a certain amount. And we can go from upper to lower body. What kind of methods? Maybe those are ones that you like. What do you like to use with your guys or girls?
Well, depending on the athlete, like if I've got a kid that, he needs to go through a solid hypertrophy phase, I'm probably not going to do a lot of aerobic work with him initially. If strength, hypertrophy is important, I might park that because it won't check all the boxes for me later on. But typically, I'll leave it up to them. If they've been a runner and they enjoy running, then go and run. If they live out in BC and there's mountains and they want to go hiking, go out for a hike, go out on the bike. Like I want them to select it themselves. I don't want to drive it. Like I remember Pierre Paget, we used to have a Nordic track cross country machine.
Oh yeah. I remember those things.
Because I want to say Pierre went to I can't remember if it was University of Moncton. He went to a school out east and there was a paper that was done there that really biomechanically the cross-country skier was the best method for a hockey player to train aerobically. Okay.
Yeah.
You know how many people went on that thing?
Tell me, not many. Yeah, there you go.
It was tough. The coaches went on it. Pierre went on it.
Yeah.
Only because it was completely unfamiliar. Nobody's cross-country. No hockey players are cross-country skiing. They're playing hockey.
Yep.
Right. So I leave it up to them. I'll give them the zones that I want them to train in. How you get there, that is up to you. I don't want to dictate that. Let them make the choice because I know they're going to do it. I know they're going to do it.
I got you, Goldie. Sounds good. Okay, I want to pivot slightly, and this is kind of off the cuff, not written, but you and I spoke about it offline, and I want to hit on this stuff. We talked about the late 80s, early 90s, and your career in the NHL. I'm now saying this. I want to talk about pendulum swings and high performance. One thing we know for certain right now, this day and age, is we are in the technology era. Like literally, I can have you jump on a force plate and have 70 metrics. I could spend one day looking at one of your jumps, right? I could look at your HRV scores for the next 2 months in a row and try to figure out and tease signal from noise. Are we too involved with digging deep holes without kind of keeping our heads up and looking at the performance landscape? Are we guilty of that? Like, where are we right now with the technology era?
Well, I think, and my friends who are in technology or PhDs in sports performance are probably going to hate me for this, but I think there's a place for it. That some of these guys are so intelligent and they're much smarter than I am, way smarter than I am. But I think sometimes when they're talking to a general manager or a coach and they're able to pull out these definitions of things and trip scores and subjective wellness scores and how it all plays into the whole package, I think some people have talked themselves into pretty good jobs. Okay.
Hey, you know what? But real quick, Bart, I want to get you back on that. I call that really I call this the Wizard of Oz. Remember the wizard, like the esoteric language, and you have to be this guy or that girl, or you speak and no one understands that kind of stuff. Sorry, I interrupted your train of thought. It bothers me.
I'm with you on that, and I don't want to paint the whole landscape like that.
No.
What I'm trying to say is I don't have a PhD, so maybe I'm pooping on this because I can't do it. Although I will say, went in as a mentor with the Ottawa Senators this past September with Matt Nichol and Jeremy Benoit and Rob Moulin in Ottawa, just to be a third set of eyes and help them out and show them. And they actually, I'm hoping I shared some things with them, but they shared some things with me. I got to run all that tech, which
Yep.
was interesting. It was
Yep.
great to do, great experience for me. I'd seen it before. I wouldn't have a problem going to a general manager and saying, "Hey, you know what? The $100,000 worth of tech that you got, and the guy to run the tech, and the data analysis. Tell you what, you give me all that money. I want a little bit more equipment, and I want to hire 2.5 staff people to help me run the program. And I think I can, just with the fundamentals of periodization and rest and recovery, I'm pretty sure I can come up with a pretty successful package and program. And the players are going to be taken care of. And I kind of feel like sometimes they get shown scores and it sets them off. I better take the day off, or I better not do that today.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that always happens, but it does happen. And people might rely on that.
Yep. I think the over reliance on constantly being objective, it takes away from the human interaction, that relate. And by the way, I know I'm just saying this as a pretense for listeners. We're not saying technology is not good. We're not. That's not what anyone's saying. It's that right now it would seem to me, from an outsider looking in. I mean, I own a small private gym. It's interesting though. I always ask everybody on the podcast. We've got some super smart people and some great colleagues and guys that are top class and girls that are top class in our field. And one thing that always comes back to me, Chad Drummond said this, Edmonton, it was brilliant. Interesting or important? Is it important or is it
Right.
interesting? I can tell you, I could lose my day in interesting. Does it drive a needle? Probably not. And then the other thing, John Stevens said, assistant coach for the Vegas Golden Knights when he was with LA, he said, one thing they always talked about is, how does it help the player? You can give me this report. That how does it help the player? And those two things I constantly come back to when I look at the technologies. Not saying that obviously if I had a budget, I would invest in a couple more odds and ends here. But I also think, last thing I'll say, Goldie, and then I'd love your opinion on this because I'm monologuing again. I'm passionate about this. I think sometimes the problems, the point of being able to have a technology is to solve a problem. I think at times the problems are coming from academia and the technology companies and not the coaches.
For sure. And those guys speak a great game. Like they speak like I follow Vald on LinkedIn and I see all their videos. Like they are uber impressive, but I'm just not sure. Like I can't remember the name of the little dynamo that they have muscle testing and grip strength with. Well, I do. Like give me a tendo and my hands, and I can look at velocity and whatever movements I want, right, left, what have you, and I'll write it down and put it into an Excel spreadsheet. And then I'll take that athlete and, do all the muscle testing that I want to do to find out, is he pass or is he fail? Right. And maybe I'm lucky because I've been doing muscle testing for 30 years. I have a pretty good feel for, he's off on the right, strong on the left, whatever, and then create a program, corrective exercise program around that. I don't know. Do I need numbers? And then the other, factor that goes in that is when you're in the middle of training camp and the cloud's not working and things aren't loading up, like not cool at all, right? And I've experienced that also. So I'm not sure what the right answer is, but you and I, we both have an opinion on it.
Yeah. I think again, coming back full circle, I think being objective is great, but I also think I'll leave it like this and be very curious. This is where I think it's art and science. I call it the metric hamburger, right? The actual burger or patty is the number. Around each patty, so what's important to measure? You better know what you value, right? And then last but not least is, how do I interpret that number and communicate it to a coach, a GM? Those things are both subjective. So at the best of times, you have to be subjective, even with an objective number. So that's where it comes. I call it a heat meter. I call it communication. I call it what you talked at the onset of our interview, buy-in. How do you communicate that to the end user as to why it's important? How does it help the player? And is it interesting or important?
Yeah. Well, and then just to close off on that, I had one colleague of mine send me, and you kind of referred to it early. He sent me screenshots of results of a vertical jump off a ball force plate, And there was so much data there. I said to him, I said, I challenge that strength coach to create a program to improve all those things. I don't want to see the data. I'll do my own program, and I'll bet you I'll be the same or better. Like in the result, like if we're dealing with the same athlete, like
Yep.
if I ever had an opportunity to, interview for another NHL job, I would absolutely try and talk the NHL GM and cutting the budget there and putting it more in manpower than in data.
Interesting perspective, Goldie, and I value your opinion. Okay, let's do our last pivot here. And maybe we hit on this before, so if it bears repeating, we can just pass on to the next question. The pendulum in performance. Again, you've been doing this for 40 years. Where are we right now? What are we doing well, and what do we need to improve on?
What are we doing well? Well, I think everybody's doing something. Okay, and that's really a blanket statement. And I'll tie it into the social media thing because you see a lot of funny things. And I'll refer to Matt Nickel and even Gary Roberts for that matter. They're two guys who I think at the top of their game in Canada and in the mecca of hockey conditioning, and they're fundamental guys. Like do the simple things savagely well, as Matt Nickel says. And when I walk around his gym and I see his coaches coaching and his players working, they're not doing circus tricks. Like they are working. They're trap bar deadlifting. They're doing front position split squats. They're doing some fundamental plyometrics. They're throwing medicine balls. They're sprinting, right? And they do it over and over and over again in a methodical manner, right? And whereas I think some coaches kind of have, I think they're training to be famous on social media. Sometimes it looks cool. So I think the guys who know, like some of the older guys in the field, like that know. Guys like Dougie Davidson
Oh, yeah.
in Vegas.
Great guy.
Like
Yep.
I worked with Dougie as part of the hiring process with him and Gary Roberts, and Dougie's like
Great guy.
he's a good, solid, fundamental guy. He's also a guy who looks at technology with a really good filter,
Big time.
because
Yep.
he's got limited resources also. So I think just if more people would just stick to the fundamentals and stay away from circus tricks, I think the world of strength and conditioning would be a much better place.
And I get guilty of this as well, so I'm going to point the thumb when I say this. But again, I've been doing this now for 20 years, so not 40. But I do think at times too, a lot of the content that is put out there, article-wise, I'm fond of saying 90% of the articles are for 10% of the population. Like those are for people that have had an unbelievable training age. They've had a program for progressive, and that's kind of the whipped cream on the sundae. That's not what they do all the time. That might be a couple. Anyways, it is interesting. Fundamentals, not fluff. Advice to young coaches, and maybe you just gave it. Is it stick with the foundation, stick with the fundamentals?
Stick with the fundamentals. Get super good with the fundamentals. And like what I don't see much anymore on social media, on people's posts, are just some of the fundamentals of Olympic style weightlifting. Like where are people breaking down a power clean into a hang clean or a pull, and where do they put that into their program, and what are the coaching points that they want to put out? I used to do that all the time when I first got into social media. When I still had the ACC, I would put stuff like that out there. I think not everybody's going to be a good Olympic weightlifter, but I would say 90 to 95% of the people can do some of the augmented exercises from the Olympic lifts. And that's like jumping with a barbell, right? Like it's loading, it's using technique and helping the athletes feel more confident while they're doing that kind of stuff.
Goldie, I know some of these guys don't have social media and they're not on it, but you had mentioned Gary Roberts, you mentioned Matty Nickel. Who are some people, if you're a young coach, hey, you got to follow this person on social media. They do a great job of showing the fundamentals. They do a great job of showing, and I get it. A lot of the older school guys and girls don't have a huge social media presence, which unfortunately is not great for young coaches.
Yeah, I think there's a few guys I follow that I just can't, I'm not pulling up their
Okay.
names right well, because all the guys who I'm in contact with and communicating with, you're right, they're not on social
I know.
media.
I know.
right? And a lot of the NFL guys are not on social media, so it's kind of hard. You gotta kind of really gotta pick and choose. But some of these things just get so fancy. Like I would just have your filter on and your antenna up when you're going through things, and really ask yourself: is this something that my athletes will benefit from? How does it mechanically going to help them develop from a foundational perspective? And really be a good filter for yourself.
Advice to young hockey players or parents, Goldie? Anything to share wisdom wise?
I've said this a million times. I've heard some other guys. I think Mark Fitzgerald may have said it on your podcast.
Yep.
Get off the ice in the summer.
Keep the off in the off season.
Yeah, like they're not. You know what? The one thing I don't get anymore, because kids are on it all the time. Like I remember, guys like Briere and Alfredson and Joe Newendike, like they would just train. They would train until the end of July and wouldn't get on the ice until early August.
Yep.
And then the favorite line I heard after they had like 8 weeks of training with no ice, it's like, holy smoke, Goldie, I felt good out there. I got some jump.
Yep.
Kids don't get to feel that anymore.
Yep.
Right? They don't get to feel that anymore. Like I know everybody's got businesses. There's the skills guy, there's the power skating guy, there's spring hockey. Like it's ridiculous.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I don't know how it is, Goldie in Canada. I can only imagine maybe in the mecca of Hockey Canada, but it is non-stop here. Just to give you an idea, in minor hockey here in Columbus at the AAA level, you gotta, and we look at the volumes here. These young guys, they're 16 to 18s, 62 games a year. That's an OHL schedule. Over 70 practices, 30 strength and conditioning sessions, so twice a week. So that's about 180 touch points during the course of the year, which is over one active day every day. As soon as the season stops, about 3 weeks later, there's tryouts. Then there's spring ice. And then after spring ice, there's summer ice. And then after summer ice, you're right back into the season. And then to make it even more, so now let's take this. Sorry, let's take the gasoline and pour it on an already lit fire. You've got I don't know how many combines, which AKA are money grabs for 95% of the population. You got hockey schools. You got this, like you just mentioned. It is really tough in this environment for an uneducated parent because the greatest American myth, as Dan Paff would say, is more is better. I always say, like, I tweeted this the other day, and I think I don't know who I stole it from. I should have given him credit for it. I get it. I never played in the National Hockey League. I played college hockey. I was a role player at best at the Division I level, and I played 2 years in the minors. I thrived on work ethic. I still do to this day. But you have to work smart too. If the hard work is the key to success, the donkey would run the farm, is the quote.
Right? Exactly. And to your point about that volume of work, I'm doing a webinar on Thursday for a group on hip health, assessment of the hip, and corrective exercise for the hip. And a couple of my slides just go over like hockey players versus skiers, right, with regards to hip health.
Yep.
And hockey players, like I think it was 14 to 18-year-olds hockey players versus the skiers. They showed labral issues, degeneration issues in that hip capsule, but the skiers did not.
Yep. I believe I know the research you're pulling from. I know exactly what you're talking about. Yep.
Yeah, they're linear. The skiers are linear, right? Yep. The hockey players are like, God did not create us to do this. We can do it, but that's not how our joints line up. So it's an overload. It's just a constant overload. So
last question, Goldie. I want to respect your time. And some people don't like this question, but I'm going to ask anyway. Some people give an answer. Some people say they don't believe in it, and that's great. Legacy. You've been in it for 40 years. Long after you're gone, how do you want to be remembered, Goldie?
Just someone who had passion for the industry, who loved what he did, who really wanted to, help people, help themselves to get better. That I made an impact. People will remember that, and hopefully somebody will quote me one day in one of their presentations.
I love it. Our guest today has been Lorne Goldenberg. Goldie, thanks so much for joining us.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Really appreciate it. It's been fun.